They have a right, especially if they've been denied access and denied participation, even in these bourgeois elections. They have a right to fight to be represented. Least we forget that in the state that we're meeting in, North Carolina, less than 50 years ago, black people could not vote. I was alive. That's the mid-60s. They could not vote. Not 200 years ago, 50 years ago. So obviously, the mere act of voting, the right to vote, in which many people were killed, sacrificed their life. There were many, struggles with terrible repression, dogs and fire hose and Klan, trying to fight the minimum right to vote in the South. It's an important thing. I think that when we look at the contradiction of Obama's election, we have to see that through this prism too. Being the first African-American president, he represents, or his election represents, a milestone for African-American people and other progressives who have been struggling against racism and to catch up in terms of representation and their democratic rights, even in bourgeois elections. And so while we don't view Obama as being any different politically than the other imperialist politicians, and you all know that the last 4 years, his policies have been absolutely no different. He's continued the wars. Wall Street is a little pissed at him because he doesn't kiss their ass enough, but he's really served their interests. The people around him, his policies. He's pursued, budget cuts, and maybe budget cuts light compared to budget cuts heavy, but that's going to intensify. The point is he's no different. However, we have to view him differently because he's African American and because we want to be in solidarity with the black working class, which may be very disappointed with him, by the way, just as the world is disappointed with him. There are probably people all over the world that thought that once he was president, there'd be a whole different, a change in U.S. imperialist policy. They found out that that was not to be the case. But we oppose Obama just as we oppose any imperialist president, but we do it more carefully. We don't personalize it in the same way we felt at liberty to do with somebody like Bush or even Clinton. But we fight the policies, not the person, because we don't want our rhetoric to be confused for even 1 minute with the racist rhetoric of the right wing that opposes him because he's black. And this is especially important, I think, for white activists to realize. They could be talking about how bad he is, but there may be some black people looking at him and saying, they don't feel too comfortable with that. It's not a big thing to ask to be tactical. Also, we realize that because he's black and because racism is inherent to capitalism, and it was predictable that racism would be used against him, including in his race for another term. If racists attack him, if he is the target of racist attacks, in spite of our differences with him, and in spite of the fact that we oppose him as an imperialist, we also want to be in a position to defend him against racists. This may seem like a contradiction, but you'll find in politics there are many contradictions. This is just one of them. Finally, I want to say what I think the biggest problem of so-called bourgeois democracy and the two capitalist party system, dominated system for us. It blocks the working class and the oppressed from developing politically and developing in an independent way, independent of capitalism, independent of their political parties and political institutions, and in a socialist direction. That, in the final analysis, is the real purpose of capitalist democracy. You know how we got saddled with the Democratic Party, which is supposed to represent our class, as opposed to the Republicans, which is supposed to represent, you know, the gilded and the rich and so forth. The Democratic Party wasn't seen the same way prior to the Depression of the 30s. But the Depression of the 30s was a catalyst for what? An uprising of workers and poor people in this country that in some instances had revolutionary potential. When people start occupying auto plants and steel plants and having general strikes, and you have these enormous marches of the unemployed that they had in New York and California and Chicago and even here in the South, and the radicalization of wider sections of the working class, more solidarity, relatively speaking, between, you know, workers of different nationalities, you know, and some of those workers looking at what was then the Soviet Union and being very much inspired, and in terms of what they want, you know, thinking that maybe that's the direction. We had that kind of situation. The 30s represented the height of radicalism in the working class in this country. But the bourgeoisie smartened up. And that wisdom or cleverness, deceitfulness really, was most represented by Roosevelt, who led the Democratic Party and was, I think, was he a three-term president? I think that's what he did, you know. It was he and the section of the ruling class that he represented who said, we got to do something. We got to do something, or else the working class is going to move faster and faster to the left, and we will lose political control. Out of that came the New Deal. Out of that came Social Security. Out of that came the right to unionize, at least for some workers. The WPA, Work Projects Administration, and a number of other things. These were concessions given by the ruling class to sort of stall the movement of the working class to more militancy and to more independence. And politically what they did was refashion the Democratic Party from what it was prior to the Depression and turn it into a party that represents us, but really doesn't. And this is your party, you know? And it was a big, big political turn, and an important turn, and a turn that we're still saddled with. And there are so many instances that we could recount over the past 70 years where the Democratic Party, while out of one side of their mouth, you know, giving lip service to the interests of the working class, you know, are doing the same thing that the Republicans are doing, no matter what office they're in, no matter what legislature they control or are in the minority, whatever the circumstances are. I'll just end by naming one or two recent ones. You know, they've really saddled labor. The labor movement is not only under the thumb of the Democratic Party, it literally finances the Democratic Party. They get most of their money. It's so frustrating, you know. Especially during a presidential election year, they'll take money that should be earmarked for organizing drives, for union organizing drives, or for mass struggles against legislation or immigrant rights, and they'll funnel that in to the Democratic Party elections at the request of the Democratic Party. You think of Wisconsin. Before Occupy, there was Occupy Madison. That's when the students and then the teachers and ultimately workers representing many sections of the public workforce and even the private workforce occupied the state capitol of Wisconsin in Madison to stop the union-busting legislation of the governor, you know, financed by the Koch brothers. Everybody's familiar with this, right? You know, and it was a tremendous development, tremendous on so many levels. Not only because the youth kind of pushed it forward, it was almost a handwriting on the wall that Occupy is coming. My understanding, I wasn't there, my understanding is that it probably wouldn't have happened if it wasn't the youth. They're the ones that gave it its impetus, and then the workers said, yeah, let's do it. And let's not just make it symbolic. Let's send thousands. whether they're inside or outside. At a certain point, once the labor leadership, which is very much influenced by the Democratic Party politicians, got in control of the situation, along with the Democratic Party, their interest was to end it, not to prolong it and make it stronger, or to say to the workers who were rising up, not quite as intensely, but also in their own way trying to repeat what they had done in Wisconsin, let's say in Ohio, in Columbus, and maybe in a few other state capitals where right-wing union-busting governors were proposing union-busting laws. You know, why they said, well, let's the fire has started. Let's make it contagious. Let's shut down the country. One of the incredible things about Wisconsin is that more than you see 99% of the time, the workers around the country got it. And they had, either they went to Wisconsin or they had solidarity demonstrations. That's very rare in this country. Very rare. I can go on and on and on about the, how the Wisconsin struggle sort of ratcheted up the working class struggle in so many ways. Even though it was local, it nationalized it. I think all the workers, both in the public sector and in the private sector, felt like Wisconsin was a national struggle. It was our struggle, even though we're here in Charlotte, or we're here in New York, or we're all the way in Oakland. This is what the working class has to do. Make local struggles national struggles on a political basis, and not just in a symbolic way, but as much as possible in a substantial way, mobilizing, occupying, and so forth. What did the Democratic Party do? It got there and said, we can't stay here. You've gotten the attention of the people, so let's just back off, and I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll have a recall election, and we will put this tremendous militant struggle that the kind of which you hardly ever see in this country, maybe in Italy, maybe in India, maybe in Mexico, maybe in Brazil, maybe someplace else, with a more militant tradition, at least over the last 30 or 40 years, and let's turn it into an electoral struggle. And when they did that, it took the militancy out of it. And the results were almost predictable. The same thing with OWS. In another way, I don't know how to compare the two. What did OWS teach us when they took over Zuccotti Park? And then after a couple of weeks, that spread all around the country. That, hey, there are a lot other ways, there are a lot more ways to get attention to your cause than waiting to vote for either a Democrat or a Republican. You can occupy things. And people are getting so angry that, what do you know? If you do it, it might be contagious. And indeed it was. And the bourgeois media gave it some attention. They were all surprised. And even at a certain point, I think it was probably about the second or third week, it actually excited the labor movement. New York City, where I live, you have one of the most conservative labor movements. It's a big labor movement, but it's top-heavy, a lot of money, very close to the Democratic Party, not known for its, militant posture in many ways, in spite of the fact that it's dynamic because it represents so many tens of thousands of African-American and Latino workers and women and immigrants, But they started showing up at the Occupy demonstrations. They started showing up, and there was this independent development, independent of the Democratic Party. But what happened over a period of weeks and months, especially as the presidential election year got closer, it became, well, you've done that, you've had your occupations, now it's time to fold up the tents. And if you don't want to fold up the tents, actually the police are coming down to help you, and maybe hitting you in the head and putting you in jail too, Now it's time to just come back into the mainstream. You've made your point, but the presidential elections are coming. So shut down the occupation. Come off the streets. You know, dissipate the militancy and come into mainstream elections. And this dynamic has probably been, along with the police repression, has probably been the biggest, or constitutes the biggest assault on the survival of OWS. The question now is, will OWS survive the bourgeois elections that are being used to, you know, turn it into something meaningless, you know? And you can think of many other examples too, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you.